Welcome back to Explaining Everything, the channel where we uncover the strange, hilarious, and unexpected stories behind everyday things. Today's question comes from one of our incredibly curious viewers, Naming Buff 77. Thanks for the suggestion, Buff. You asked, when did people start using surnames? Great question. Have you ever wondered why we even have last names? Like, at what point in history did people decide that John wasn't enough and that we needed to add Smith or Underhill, or, if your ancestors were particularly unlucky, something like Stinky Bottom? Well, today, we're traveling back in time to figure out when, why, and how surnames became a thing. And trust me, some of the stories behind them are absolutely ridiculous. So, if you've ever been grateful that your last name isn't Bacon Butt, stick around as we break it all down, right here on Explaining Everything. So, let's start with the ancient times. Back in the day, like really back in the day, most people just had one name. You were Bob, you were Alice, you were Steve. Simple. Life was good. But then things got messy. Imagine a tiny village with 5 different Johns. Chaos. Utter chaos. Some ancient civilizations did use extra names, though. The Romans, for example, had a whole system of names: personal name, family name, and a nickname. Which sounds fancy until you realize Roman nicknames were basically roast sessions. Julius Big Nose was a real thing. And if you had an embarrassing feature, congrats, that's your new last name. But after Rome collapsed, Europe kind of forgot about surnames for a while. People were too busy dealing with war, plagues, and the daily struggle of not getting eaten by wolves. Who had time to worry about last names? Fast forward to the Middle Ages, when society was like, okay, we really need to do something about all these Johns. So people started adding identifiers to their names. At first, they were super straightforward. If you were John who lived near the river, congrats. You're now John Rivers. If you were Tom the Baker, boom, Tom Baker. If you had red hair, welcome to your new identity, Robert Redhead. And if you were just really unlucky, you might end up with something tragic, like Roger Bad Breath. Surnames weren't exactly official yet, but they were sticking around. And once governments got involved, because governments love organizing people, last names became a requirement. In England, this process sped up after the Norman conquest in 1066, because the Normans were all about fancy names. If you were a peasant before, you were just Jack. Now you were Jack Underhill, which sounds way more sophisticated, even though you were still, shoveling manure. Surnames generally fell into 4 categories. 1. Occupational names. If your ancestor was a carpenter, tailor, or smith, congrats. That's your family name forever, even if you've never held a hammer in your life. 2nd. Location-based names. If you lived by a hill, a forest, or a creek, congratulations, your family tree is forever tied to geography. If only they'd picked a cool place, like John from Gold Mountain, instead of John from Mud Puddle. 3rd, patronymic names. These are names based on your dad's name, like Johnson, which literally means John's son. So yes, at some point, people were running around being called William Williamson. Creative. 4. Nicknames. If your ancestor was short, tall, bald, or had an unfortunate nose, that probably became your last name. and you're stuck with it for eternity. Ever met a guy named Short? Yeah, that was probably a medieval insult that just never died. Different cultures did surnames differently. The Chinese were way ahead of the game. They had family names as early as 2852 BC. So while Europe was still calling people John who smells weird, China was already getting sophisticated with family names passed down for generations. Meanwhile, in Iceland, they were like, nah, we're not doing this permanent surname thing. They still use patronymic names, meaning if your dad's name is Eric, you'd be Eriksson if you're a guy, or Eriksdottir if you're a girl, which is cool, except it changes every generation. So imagine the family reunions. Total nightmare for record keeping. Then there's Spain, where people just couldn't pick one last name, so they took two. If you've ever seen a Spanish name that looks like an entire sentence, that's why. Somewhere along the way, they were like, let's just take Mom's name too, and Grandma's, and let's never stop. These days, surnames are mostly just something you're stuck with, whether they make sense or not. Some people change them, especially celebrities. I mean, do you think Vin Diesel was actually born Vin Diesel? Nope. His real last name is Sinclair. But let's be real, Vin Sinclair doesn't sound like he can flip cars and punch people through walls. And then you have people hyphenating names, which is all fun and games until two people with hyphenated names get married. Imagine a kid named Smith Johnson Williams Brown. That kid's gonna need an extra long driver's license. So, when did people start using surnames? The short answer: a really long time ago, but not all at once. They mostly became official between the 11th and 15th centuries, and they've stuck around ever since. And now, whether you like your last name or not, you're kinda stuck with it, unless you change it. In which case, may I suggest something legendary, like Dragon Master or Thunderstrike? Now that is a name worthy of kings. If you enjoyed this video, or if you're booking a trip to City Hall to legally change your name to something cooler, leave a like and don't forget to subscribe. Also, if you have suggestions for our next video, feel free to share them in the comments below. We'll be sure to give you an acknowledgement for your contribution. Thank you for tuning in, and join us next time here in the channel that answers all the why, what, who, where, and how questions you've always wondered about, here on Explaining Everything.